People in the Middle Ages didn't have fridges, but they still found smart ways to keep food from going bad. Some of those old tricks still work today, and they're a lot more useful than you'd think. These methods help people survive, and they're not just history. Starting with salt curing, this might be the oldest food preservation trick in human history, and it's still going strong today. Long before refrigerators hummed in our kitchens, people discovered that rubbing meat with salt made it last for months instead of days. The science is simple but brilliant. Salt pulls moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria simply can't survive. No water, no bacterial party. In medieval times, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was liquid gold. People would travel hundreds of miles just to get their hands on this precious mineral. Coastal communities had a massive advantage, setting up salt evaporation ponds along shorelines, while inland folks often paid ridiculous prices for salt carried by merchants. Some medieval salt traders were so wealthy they could buy entire villages, which proves that selling something that makes food not rot was basically the medieval version of inventing Facebook. The value of salt was so immense that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with it. That's where our word salary comes from, derived from salarium. Imagine showing up to work on payday and your boss hands you a bag of salt instead of a check. Good luck paying your rent with that. Every region developed their own salt-curing specialties. In the cold north, salt cod became a staple that could survive the harshest winters. In Mediterranean countries, salt-cured hams like prosciutto developed into an art form, with specialized curing chambers and techniques passed down through generations. These weren't just preservation methods. They were creating entirely new foods with complex flavors that people actually preferred over fresh meat. The most impressive part? Many of these ancient techniques remain virtually unchanged today. When you bite into a piece of prosciutto or beef jerky, you're tasting essentially the same food that medieval people enjoyed. The same natural processes, the same chemical reactions, just without the constant fear of plague and Vikings. Salt curing wasn't just about survival. It changed how people traveled and traded. Ships could now stay at sea for months with preserved foods that wouldn't spoil. Sailors may have had scurvy and missing teeth, but at least they had plenty of salty meat to gum on during those long voyages. And salt was just the beginning of medieval ingenuity when it came to keeping dinner from spoiling. Smoking meat ranks as one of medieval Europe's most brilliant preservation methods, turning ordinary cuts of pork, beef, and fish into long-lasting food that actually tasted better than when it started. Unlike salt, which simply prevented decay, smoke added new flavors while keeping food safe to eat for months. How did it work? The science behind smoking is fascinating. When wood burns slowly, it releases compounds called phenols and formaldehyde, natural preservatives that coat the surface of meat and slow down bacterial growth. These same compounds give smoked meat that distinctive flavor we still crave today. Medieval people didn't know the chemistry, but they definitely knew the results. Two main smoking techniques developed during medieval times. Cold smoking kept meat at temperatures below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, slowly drying it out over days or even weeks. Hot smoking, on the other hand, partially cooked the meat while infusing it with that smoky flavor. Think of it as medieval multitasking. Back then, having smoke-flavored breath was probably considered attractive. "Oh, he smells like smoked ham" wasn't an insult. It was a medieval pickup line. Different regions favored different woods for their unique flavors. Oak and hickory were popular in northern Europe, while fruit woods like apple and cherry were prized in orchard regions. People discovered that the type of wood used would dramatically change the flavor of the final product, a culinary discovery we still appreciate in modern barbecue. Monasteries became unexpected centers for smoked meat production. Many medieval monks specialized in smoking techniques, creating tradable goods that brought income to their communities. Some monasteries built special smoke rooms with hooks hanging from the ceiling where meats could cure for months. These monks weren't just preserving food, they were developing culinary traditions that would last for centuries. The smoking method created some of our most beloved foods. Bacon, ham, kippers, and smoked salmon all trace their origins to medieval smoking techniques. These weren't just preserved foods, they were delicacies. The next time you enjoy a slice of bacon, remember you're basically eating like medieval royalty, just with fewer sword fights at the dinner table. As effective as smoke and salt were, people throughout the Middle Ages continued to develop even more ingenious ways to keep their food edible through long winters and unpredictable harvests. Did medieval people know something we've forgotten? Air drying, perhaps the simplest preservation method of all, worked miracles with nothing more than careful placement and patience. This technique relied on three things that cost absolutely nothing: airflow, sunshine, and low humidity. Medieval households dried almost everything. Herbs hung upside down from rafters, mushrooms strung on threads across windows, fish splayed open in coastal breezes, thin slices of meat turned into portable jerky, and even pasta dried on racks in Italy. The process was simple. Remove moisture, and food would last for months. The biggest challenge? Keeping bugs away. People developed solutions like wrapping foods in cheesecloth or hanging them high in smoke-filled rafters where insects couldn't reach. Many medieval homes had special drying corners that family members protected like modern people guard their Wi-Fi passwords. In drier regions like southern Spain, drying happened outdoors, but in damper northern areas, finding the right indoor spot made all the difference between preserved food and moldy waste. The most impressive thing is how little this technique has changed. Today's dry-cured meats, Spanish jamon, Italian bresaola, use almost exactly the same processes developed in medieval times. The only difference? Medieval people did this out of necessity, while we pay premium prices for these artisanal foods. Air drying teaches us something powerful. Sometimes the most effective solution is also the simplest. No special equipment, no complex chemistry, just working with nature. While air drying worked wonders when conditions were right, medieval people still needed ways to preserve food during challenging seasons. Their next innovative solution involved something abundant in winter, but precious in summer. Before electric freezers existed, medieval people created their own cold storage systems called ice houses. These clever structures allowed communities to keep perishable foods fresh during warm months using ice harvested during winter. It was nature's refrigerator, and it worked surprisingly well. The ice harvesting process began in the dead of winter when lakes and ponds froze solid. Teams would cut large blocks using special saws, then haul them to specially built ice houses where the ice was packed tightly and insulated with layers of straw, sawdust, or sheep's wool. Medieval ice houses were engineering marvels, mostly built partially underground where the earth naturally maintained cooler temperatures. The walls were thick, often made of stone or packed earth, with small entrances to minimize warm air intrusion. The medieval ice delivery man had the coldest job in town, literally. When someone asks what job would give you the chills back then, ice keeper wins hands down. These ice houses could keep their frozen cargo solid for months, sometimes well into autumn, 6 to 8 months after harvest. Persian engineers created even more advanced versions called yakchals, dome-shaped structures that could keep ice frozen throughout the entire summer in desert regions. People stored meats, fish, dairy products, and even some fruits and vegetables in these icy chambers. The colder temperatures significantly slowed bacterial growth, extending the shelf life of foods that would otherwise spoil within days. Medieval kings served ice cream as the ultimate power move. Nothing says, "I'm filthy rich," like eating frozen desserts before electricity existed. While keeping food cold was revolutionary, medieval cooks also discovered that submerging certain foods in tangy liquids created an entirely different kind of preservation magic. Pickling stands as one of the most versatile food preservation methods medieval people mastered. The basic concept was wonderfully straightforward. Soak foods in vinegar or brine, salt water, to create an environment where harmful bacteria simply couldn't survive. What makes pickling so remarkable is how many different foods could be preserved this way, from vegetables and eggs to fish and even meats. The science works because most spoilage bacteria can't thrive in highly acidic environments. Vinegar, with its acetic acid content, creates exactly this kind of hostile bacterial environment. Similarly, heavily salted brine solutions draw moisture out of both food and any bacteria trying to grow on it. These simple chemical principles allowed medieval households to store seasonal foods for months beyond their natural shelf life. In medieval Europe, nearly every region developed its own pickling traditions. German communities created sauerkraut by fermenting cabbage in its own juices with salt. Mediterranean cultures preserved olives in brine. English households pickled onions, eggs, and walnuts in spiced vinegar. Nordic countries perfected methods for pickling herring that remain popular today. Medieval sailors carried barrels of pickled vegetables on long voyages, not just for preservation, but because they helped prevent scurvy. Imagine being the first sailor to discover that eating strange-smelling cabbage from a barrel kept your teeth from falling out. Talk about a hard sell to your crewmates. Pickling wasn't just practical, it transformed foods in delicious ways. Many pickled items were considered delicacies rather than merely preserved necessities. Royal courts across Europe served pickled fruits and vegetables as status symbols, often importing exotic ingredients specifically for pickling. The Tower of London even had dedicated pickling kitchens where royal cooks prepared special preserves for the king's table. Pickling containers evolved over time. Early medieval picklers used wooden barrels and ceramic crocks. By the late Middle Ages, glass containers became more common among wealthy households. The containers needed to be non-reactive, avoiding metals like copper or iron to prevent chemical reactions with the acidic pickling solutions. What's most impressive is how little pickling techniques have changed over the centuries. The pickled cucumbers, kimchi, and sauerkraut we enjoy today follow almost identical principles to those medieval picklers developed through trial and error. When you open a jar of pickles from your fridge, you're basically performing a food ritual that would be completely familiar to someone from the 1200s, minus the refrigerator, plastic jar, and electricity, of course. While pickling mastered the art of preservation through acidity, medieval cooks discovered another microbial magic trick that didn't just preserve food, it transformed it in unexpected and beneficial ways. Many people today think fermentation is the same as rotting, but medieval folks knew better. Fermentation isn't about food going bad. It's a controlled transformation that creates something entirely new and often better than what you started with. This preservation technique harnessed the power of good bacteria to fight off the bad ones, turning ordinary foods into long-lasting nutritional powerhouses. Rotting is what happens when you forget about that container in the back of your fridge for 6 months. Fermentation is what happens when you deliberately create the perfect conditions for beneficial microbes to thrive. Medieval people might not have known about bacteria by name, but they understood the process remarkably well. How did it work? Take sauerkraut as an example. Cabbage was finely shredded, mixed with salt, then packed tightly into containers to remove oxygen. The salt drew out moisture from the cabbage, creating a natural brine where good bacteria thrived while harmful ones couldn't survive. These good bacteria produced lactic acid, which both preserved the food and gave it that distinctive tangy flavor. Medieval people fermented milk into yogurt and cheese, fruit juices into wine, and grains into beer and bread. Each fermented food had its own community of beneficial microbes doing the preservation work. Fermented drinks played a particularly important role in medieval life. Water quality was often questionable, but the fermentation process killed harmful pathogens. Medieval children drank weak beer for breakfast, which probably explains why history class always depicts them looking like tiny adults with serious expressions. Different environments naturally developed different fermentation traditions. In colder northern climates, fermented cabbage and root vegetables helped communities survive long winters. In warmer regions, milk quickly spoiled without refrigeration, so yogurt and cheese became dietary staples. While fermentation worked wonders for food preservation, medieval people discovered another preservation approach that added flavor and medicinal benefits. Alcohol wasn't just for drinking in medieval times. It was a powerful food preservation tool that could make fruits, herbs, and other perishables last for months or even years. From the 1100s to the 1300s, monasteries and noble households perfected the art of using wine, ale, and spirits to preserve everything from cherries to medicinal herbs. The basic principle behind alcoholic preservation is deceptively simple. Alcohol kills most bacteria that cause food to spoil. Medieval people understood this connection even if they didn't understand the microscopic reasons why it worked. They noticed that food submerged in wine or strong spirits lasted much longer than those left in the open air. Fruit preserves were among the most popular alcohol-preserved foods. Cherries, plums, and berries would be packed into jars or barrels, then covered with wine or brandy. Herbs were steeped in alcohol to create tinctures and tonics that maintained their healing properties longer than dried herbs alone. Low alcohol beverages like ale and mead weren't just for getting medieval people through their day-to-day hardships. They were safer to drink than water from the local well. When the choice is between drinking slightly alcoholic beer or playing diarrhea roulette with the town water supply, it's not hard to see why medieval children grew up with a taste for ale. As distillation techniques improved in the later Middle Ages, high-proof spirits became available and dramatically improved preservation capabilities. Medieval celebrations often featured special preserved treats that had been stored since the previous harvest season. Fruitcakes soaked in brandy were holiday favorites across Europe. These dense, alcohol-soaked cakes could last for years, which might explain why that fruitcake your aunt gives you every Christmas seems so indestructible. It's not just a dessert, it's practically medieval technology. While alcoholic preservation excelled at keeping certain foods viable above ground, medieval people also developed ingenious ways to use the earth itself as a natural refrigerator. Root cellars and underground storage spaces were the medieval version of refrigerators, using the earth's natural cooling and insulating properties to keep food fresh. These clever underground rooms maintained a steady temperature year-round, cool in summer and insulated from freezing in winter, creating the perfect environment for storing everything from vegetables to wine. The earth maintains a remarkably constant temperature about 8 feet below the surface, typically between 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the weather above ground. Medieval people used this natural phenomenon to their advantage, creating rooms partially or completely underground for natural refrigeration. In rocky regions, root cellars might be carved directly into hillsides or built into existing caves. In flatter areas, they were dug into the ground and reinforced with wooden beams, stone, or brick walls. Most designs included a small entrance facing north to reduce sun exposure and sometimes featured air vents to control humidity. Medieval root cellars were basically underground food apartments. The rent was cheap, the temperature control was excellent, but the neighbors were usually rats and the occasional toad. Root cellars stored more than just root vegetables. Apples, pears, cabbage, onions, and even eggs could last for months in these cool chambers. Wine and cider benefited greatly from the constant cool temperatures, developing better flavors over time. Different foods required different storage conditions. Some needed high humidity, others needed drier air. Carrots might be buried in sandy soil to prevent drying out, while onions were hung from rafters to keep dry. A well-built root cellar could mean the difference between starving in late winter and having enough food to last until spring. Underground food storage was so effective that many homesteaders, preppers, and off-grid enthusiasts still build root cellars today. It's probably the only medieval technology that doomsday preppers and organic farmers can agree is absolutely brilliant. The beauty of underground storage was how it worked with nature rather than against it. But for some foods, even the cool conditions of a root cellar weren't enough. For these, medieval people turned to another remarkable preservation technique that transformed one of the most perishable foods into something that could last for months or even years. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in medieval times, but turning it into cheese extended its shelf life by months or even years. This transformation wasn't just practical, it created entirely new foods with complex flavors that became dietary staples throughout Europe. Without refrigeration, cheese making wasn't just a culinary choice, it was essential food security. The medieval cheese-making process began with fresh milk, usually from cows, sheep, or goats. Rennet, an enzyme from calf stomachs, was the miracle worker here. When added to warm milk, rennet caused the proteins to clump together, forming solid curds in a matter of hours. Once the curds formed, they would be cut, drained, and sometimes pressed to remove excess whey. Salt was added both for flavor and preservation, as it helped draw out moisture and prevent harmful bacteria from growing. Making cheese was a bit like medieval alchemy, except instead of turning lead into gold, you turned liquid that goes bad in a day into solids that last for years. Plus, you could eat the results, which is more than you can say for most alchemy experiments. Aging was where true cheese magic happened. Young cheeses were placed in cool environments, often natural caves or specially built cheese cellars, where they would slowly transform as they aged. During this time, beneficial molds and bacteria worked on the cheese, developing complex flavors. The most impressive medieval cheeses were the hard, aged varieties that required months or even years of careful attention. Parmesan-style cheeses originated during this era, with some wheels weighing up to 80 pounds and aging for 2 years or more. Medieval cheese caves provided the perfect environment for long aging, cool, humid, and naturally insulated. They were essentially cheese spas where wheels could relax and mature at their own pace, much like modern retirement communities, but for dairy products. What's most remarkable is how many of these ancient cheese-making techniques remain virtually unchanged today. The artisanal cheese movement is essentially rediscovering methods that medieval cheesemakers would instantly recognize. While turning milk into long-lasting cheese was ingenious, medieval people developed yet another preservation technique that created an almost impenetrable barrier between food and the outside world. Hot wax and animal fat served as medieval food preservers by creating airtight seals that kept food fresh for months. These simple but effective methods prevented exposure to air, the main culprit behind food spoilage. Wax sealing and fat packing were among the final lines of defense in the medieval preservation arsenal, often used after foods had already been processed using other techniques. Let's start with wax sealing. Beeswax was the most common material, harvested from beehives and melted down to create a liquid that would harden into a solid protective coating. Medieval cooks would pour thin layers of melted wax over the surface of jams, jellies, and preserves to create an airtight seal. Once the wax hardened, it formed a barrier that prevented mold and bacteria from reaching the food underneath. Wax wasn't just for sweet preserves. Hard cheeses were often dipped entirely in wax, creating a protective shell that allowed them to age properly while preventing unwanted mold growth. Some cheeses, like Gouda, are still traditionally coated in wax today. Wax sealing was basically like giving your food its own personal bodyguard. Sorry, Mr. Bacteria, you're not on the guest list. No spoilage allowed past this waxy barrier. Fat packing worked on similar principles, but used animal fats instead of wax. One of the most famous examples is confit, a technique where meat, typically duck, goose, or pork, was slow cooked in its own fat, then stored completely submerged in that same fat. The layer of fat hardened at cool temperatures, creating a seal that kept air away from the meat. The preservation magic happened because fat creates an oxygen-free environment, and bacteria need oxygen to grow. Meats preserved this way could last for months, sometimes even years, and developed unique flavors and textures that were considered delicacies. Food-grade wax and fat sealing were essentially the medieval version of vacuum sealing. It's like they invented Tupperware 1,000 years early, just without the search for matching lids that mysteriously disappear. These 10 medieval preservation methods remind us that sometimes the old ways are still worth knowing. In our world of refrigeration and mass-produced food, it's easy to forget that humans kept food safe and delicious for centuries, using nothing but careful observation and natural materials. In the Middle Ages, not every job was about fighting or farming. Some people worked in ways most of us wouldn't even try for 5 minutes. These jobs were messy, strange, and sometimes hard to believe, but they were real. Let's kick things off with one of the most putrid professions of the Middle Ages, the tanner. These brave souls transformed raw animal hides into leather using methods that would make your stomach turn. When an animal was slaughtered, tanners took the unwanted skins and began their foul work. How did they remove hair and flesh from the hides? By soaking everything in vats filled with urine. The medieval tanning industry was basically one giant toilet bowl with a business plan. Talk about a job where you were literally taking the piss. Towns collected urine in communal pots for tanners to use. In some places, special urine collectors would go door to door gathering this precious tanning fluid from households. If they ran short on urine, they'd substitute with dog or chicken poop. Medieval fashion was quite literally the product of craftsmanship. This disgusting process could last for months. Tanners would regularly stir these putrid vats with long poles, releasing clouds of eye-watering ammonia. The stench was so overpowering that medieval towns forced tanners to work downwind from everyone else. Laws required tanneries to be built on the edge of town, usually downstream so their waste wouldn't contaminate water that other trades needed. In some cities, tanners could only marry within their profession because nobody else could stand their smell. Their dating profile would have read, "Enjoys long walks by the cesspool and brings work home with him." Literally. The smell permanently embedded itself in their skin and clothes, making them instantly recognizable and avoidable in any crowd. Despite creating essential products, shoes, belts, armor straps, saddles, and more, tanners were paid terribly. A skilled tanner might spend a full year processing leather, earning barely enough to feed his family. It was the only job where your career quite literally stank, and so did your paycheck. The finished leather was incredibly durable, though. All that soaking in bodily waste actually created products that could last for decades. Many of the leather items preserved from the medieval period still maintain their strength and flexibility today, which is pretty impressive considering they're hundreds of years old. Speaking of jobs nobody wanted, at least tanners kept their feet on solid ground. Other medieval workers weren't so lucky, especially those who faced danger at dizzying heights. Have you ever wondered how those massive stone blocks got to the top of medieval cathedrals? Meet the treadmill crane operators, the unsung daredevils of medieval construction. These workers spent their days inside giant wooden wheels that looked like oversized hamster toys. The principle was simple. Humans walked inside these massive wooden treadmills to generate power, which then lifted heavy stones and building materials to dizzying heights. Medieval construction crews were basically using human-sized pet toys to build churches. Gym memberships were completely unnecessary back then. The treadmill cranes towered hundreds of feet in the air above cathedral construction sites. Unlike modern workers with safety harnesses and steel-toed boots, medieval crane operators had nothing. No safety equipment, no backup plans, just wooden platforms beneath their feet and the constant awareness that one slip meant certain death. A single treadmill could lift stones weighing up to 2,000 pounds. Sometimes multiple men would work inside a single wheel, coordinating their steps to maintain a steady lifting pace. One medieval record from Notre Dame Cathedral noted that 4 men working a treadmill could lift a 1-ton stone about 70 feet in just 10 minutes. Impressive efficiency considering they were basically just walking in place. The worst danger came from the wheel itself. The wooden mechanism had no brakes or safety stops. If a worker tripped or lost their footing while a heavy stone was being lifted, the wheel would spin backward at incredible speed. It was essentially a medieval version of being thrown into a washing machine. Except instead of getting clean, you'd get crushed. Limbs caught in the reversing wheel would be instantly mangled or severed. During winter, the job became even more treacherous. Wooden platforms would become slick with ice and snow, while the workers' frozen hands struggled to maintain their grip. Many cathedrals took decades to complete, which meant generations of wheelwalkers climbed to those deadly heights day after day, year after year. Despite the crucial nature of their work, treadmill operators were among the lowest paid construction workers. Their dangerous efforts literally raised medieval cities toward the heavens, yet they received almost no recognition. While master masons and architects gained fame and fortune, the men who powered the actual lifting remained anonymous figures in history, from heights that would make most people dizzy to depths that would make anyone gag. The next job involves diving into the foulest pits in medieval society. What happened after medieval people used the toilet? Someone had to deal with that mess. Enter the gong farmer, possibly the worst-smelling job in history. Gong was actually an old word for waste or excrement, so these weren't farmers in the traditional sense, unless you count harvesting human poop as agriculture. Their crop was crap, and business was always booming. Gong farmers worked exclusively at night, from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning. Medieval towns simply didn't want to see or smell these workers during daylight hours when people were trying to eat or conduct business. Their task? To climb down into cesspits and latrines beneath medieval towns and scoop out human waste. With no indoor plumbing, medieval toilets were typically holes that dropped waste into pits below. Armed with shovels and buckets, gong farmers would descend into these foul chambers and manually remove the contents. The dangers were numerous. Many died from falling into deep cesspits and drowning in excrement. Others succumbed to asphyxiation from methane gas. Disease was constant, with no protection except perhaps a rag tied over the face. Surprisingly, gong farmers were well paid. In 16th century England, they earned 6 pence per ton of waste removed, about what a skilled craftsman might make in an entire week. When your job literally stinks, at least the pay shouldn't. The collected waste would be carted to dumping grounds outside city walls or sold to farmers as fertilizer. Despite their crucial role in keeping medieval cities from drowning in their own filth, gong farmers were social outcasts who lived in segregated areas and even sat apart in church. While gong farmers dealt with the waste of the living, other medieval workers had to handle those who'd left this world. Life was harsh in medieval times, and someone had to carry out justice's darkest sentences. The executioner stood ready with an axe, rope, or hot iron in hand, delivering society's final punishment to criminals. Unlike today's anonymous prison workers, medieval executioners were well known, yet universally avoided. The job came with a strange mix of legal protection and social rejection. Executioners couldn't be charged with murder for their official duties. They were the only people who could kill someone in public and get thanked instead of arrested. But this legal protection came at a steep social cost. Most executioners lived on the edge of town in isolated homes marked with red paint or special symbols. They wore distinctive clothing like bright red hoods or gloves, making them instantly recognizable and avoidable wherever they went. Their work went far beyond simple hangings. Medieval executioners were skilled in multiple forms of death and torture, from quick beheadings to drawn-out punishments designed to cause maximum suffering. They needed to understand anatomy well enough to break someone on the wheel without killing them too quickly or to remove a hand without causing fatal blood loss. Being an executioner was often a family business passed down through generations. Children of executioners typically couldn't attend regular schools or marry outside their caste. Talk about bringing your work home. Dinner conversation at an executioner's house must have been absolutely killer. Due to their outcast status, executioners often took on additional unsavory tasks that no one else wanted. They might remove dead animal carcasses from streets, clean the town gallows, or collect taxes from lepers and prostitutes. In some towns, they even doubled as gong farmers during busy periods. While feared by most, executioners were sometimes sought out as healers. People believed that an executioner's touch had magical healing properties. Some executioners sold pieces of the rope used in hangings as good luck charms or medicine. Medieval folk would literally buy something from the same guy who just chopped off their neighbor's head. From delivering death as punishment to collecting creatures that delivered life-saving medicine, our next disgusting medieval job involved wading into cold ponds for slimy, blood-sucking creatures. Before modern medicine, bloodletting was all the rage. Doctors believed that removing bad blood could cure almost any ailment. Enter the leech collector, medieval medicine's unsung hero, who supplied these blood-hungry creatures to doctors across Europe. The job was simple in theory, but awful in practice. Leech collectors would wade barefoot into muddy ponds and swamps where leeches lived. The goal? To become bait. It was the only profession where success meant literally having the lifeblood sucked out of you. Talk about a job that really gets under your skin. Most collectors used their own legs as leech lures, walking slowly through shallow water until the parasites attached to their bare skin. Once a good number had latched on, they would carefully remove them and place them in containers filled with water. These workers were the original blood donors, except instead of a cookie and orange juice afterward, they got poverty and infections. The physical toll was immense. Constant blood loss led to weakness, anemia, and dizziness. The wounds from leech bites often became infected, and collectors developed open sores on their legs that never fully healed. Their dating prospects were pretty limited too. So what do you do for a living? Rarely went well when the answer was, I let swamp creatures feast on my blood. At the height of the bloodletting craze in the early 1800s, France alone was importing more than 40 million leeches per year. The demand was so high that natural leech populations were nearly wiped out in some areas of Europe. This scarcity drove prices up, making the profession briefly lucrative despite its obvious drawbacks. It was the medieval version of a startup bubble, just with more actual sucking. As difficult as dealing with blood-sucking creatures was, at least leech collectors generally worked with the living. Some medieval jobs required facing something far worse. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, someone had to collect and bury the mounting piles of corpses. Plague barriers took on this grim task, becoming the final handlers for victims of history's most devastating pandemic. Death carts rumbled through streets day and night, accompanied by the haunting call, "Bring out your dead." Plague barriers would go door to door, collecting bodies from homes where entire families had perished. They used long hooks to drag corpses from buildings without having to enter, though this grim method often resulted in bodies being badly damaged. Medieval social distancing was less about staying 6 feet apart and more about keeping 6 feet under. The risk was enormous. These workers had almost no protection from infection beyond a simple cloth mask soaked in vinegar or herbs, which they believed would filter out the bad air that spread disease. Many plague barriers were criminals given the choice between this deadly work or execution. Others were desperate peasants who had lost everything and saw this dangerous job as their only option for survival. In London alone, records suggest more than 100,000 people died during the worst outbreak of plague, roughly half the city's population. At the height of the pandemic, plague barriers could collect several hundred bodies per day from a single neighborhood. The sheer volume overwhelmed church graveyards, forcing the creation of massive plague pits outside city walls. These pits were nightmarish. Some were 40 feet deep and could hold thousands of bodies layered with lime to reduce the smell. In archaeological excavations of these sites, bodies are often found tossed in haphazardly, a stark contrast to the careful burials normally practiced in medieval times. If you think your job is soul-crushing, at least you're not literally surrounded by piles of corpses every workday. Initially, plague barriers attempted some semblance of funeral rites, saying brief prayers as they worked. But as death tolls mounted, even these minimal ceremonies disappeared. Bodies were simply dumped as quickly as possible before the barriers moved on to the next collection point. Many plague barriers received free alcohol to help them cope with the horror and mask the stench of decomposition. This led to stories of drunken burial teams dropping bodies in the streets or fighting over valuable items found on corpses. The workplace drinking policy was less, "It's 5 o'clock somewhere," and more, "Drink until you can't smell death anymore." The psychological toll was immeasurable. Plague barriers often became numb to the constant exposure to death, developing a dark humor that shocked their contemporaries. Many died from the plague themselves, while survivors were permanently marked by their experiences, sometimes literally, as communities would brand or tattoo plague workers to identify them even after the epidemic passed. While plague barriers dealt with the dead, other medieval workers had to endure some truly foul working conditions. Laundry was a team sport in medieval times. You brought the cloth. They brought the bodily fluids. Fullers were essential workers who turned rough, freshly woven wool into usable fabric, using methods that would make modern dry cleaners quit on the spot. The fulling process was crucial for wool fabric. Raw wool straight from the loom was loose, oily, and unwearable. To make it suitable for clothing, it needed to be fulled, a process that cleaned, thickened, and strengthened the material. And how did medieval fullers accomplish this vital textile transformation? With a disgusting combination of human urine, clay, and vigorous stomping. First, fullers collected urine. Lots of it. Fresh urine wouldn't do. They needed the stale stuff that had broken down into ammonia. In medieval towns, fullers would leave collection pots on street corners where men would relieve themselves after a night at the tavern. It gives a whole new meaning to community contribution. In some places, fullers collected household urine in jars that were left on the street specifically for this purpose, sometimes paying a small fee for particularly well-fermented batches. Once enough urine was gathered, fullers would pour it into large wooden vats along with the raw wool cloth. Then came the truly revolting part. Workers would climb into these vats barefoot and begin stomping on the fabric, often for hours at a time. The ammonia in the urine would break down grease and oils in the wool, while the stomping action matted the fibers together, creating a denser, stronger material. The fuller's life was a stinking one. They spent their days ankle-deep in human waste, performing exhausting physical labor. The ammonia fumes caused eye and lung irritation, while prolonged exposure to urine led to foot infections and skin problems. You could always identify a fuller by their distinctive walk, a combination of chemical burns and the permanent stench that kept everyone at a distance. In larger textile towns, fulling mills eventually developed, where wooden hammers powered by water wheels would pound the fabric instead of human feet. but human-powered fulling remained common in many places until the late medieval period. Records from Florence, Italy, show that in the early 14th century, the city had over 200 fulling workshops employing thousands of workers, all processing wool in urine vats. After stomping, the cloth would be rinsed in water and stretched on large wooden frames called tenters, which gave us the phrase on tenterhooks. Fullers would use sharp hooks to stretch the cloth evenly as it dried, ensuring the final product was smooth and uniform. The profession was so important that Fuller became a common surname that still exists today. If your last name is Fuller, congratulations. Your ancestors likely spent their days stomping around in medieval pee pools. That's something to share at family reunions. While fullers used plenty of urine in their work, they didn't always collect it themselves. There was an even more unpleasant profession dedicated solely to gathering this valuable medieval resource. Enter the urine collector, a medieval professional with possibly the least appealing container in history. These brave souls walked town streets gathering human waste liquid from homes and public collection pots. Medieval people didn't use fancy terminology. These workers were bluntly called piss collectors. When your job title makes small children giggle and adults cringe, you know you've reached a special level of career achievement. Their daily routine involved carrying heavy, sloshing buckets through narrow, filthy streets full of obstacles. One wrong step on uneven cobblestones could mean disaster. A spill that would ruin your day, your clothes, and any chance of being welcome in public places for weeks. The collectors delivered their aromatic harvests to tanners, cloth fullers, and dyers who relied on urine's ammonia for breaking down materials. They were essentially medieval recycling workers, just with a product nobody wanted to acknowledge producing. Urine was surprisingly valuable in the medieval economy. Professional collectors could earn decent wages, especially in major textile towns with high demand. Some town records show urine collectors making more than common laborers, proving that handling disgusting materials could literally pay off. However, their pay came with obvious social costs. Collectors were avoided by most townspeople and typically lived in isolated areas. They were the original essential workers, absolutely necessary for industries to function, yet people only wanted to see them when they needed something. While urine collectors dealt with one bodily fluid, other medieval workers faced even more dangerous encounters with creatures that actively tried to bite, scratch, and infect them. These were the original exterminators, just less gloves, more teeth. Rat catchers handled medieval Europe's relentless rodent problem using methods that would make modern health inspectors faint. Rats thrived in medieval cities. Poor sanitation, open sewers, and accessible food storage created a rat paradise. When infestations threatened to destroy a family's winter food supply or spread disease, desperate towns would hire rat catchers. Most rat catchers used their bare hands, small clubs, or nets to capture rodents. Some used trained dogs or ferrets to flush rats from hiding places. Payment often depended on producing evidence of kills, so rat catchers would cut off the tails as proof. Some dishonest rat catchers ran scams by releasing pregnant females back into buildings, ensuring future employment. It was the medieval version of job security. Breed your own customers. The health risks were enormous. Rat bites frequently became infected, and fleas jumping from rats to humans spread bubonic plague. They were essentially playing a deadly game of tag with the Grim Reaper every workday. In a cruel twist of fate, rat catchers were often blamed for the very plague outbreaks they were fighting against. Their contact with infected areas made them appear to be carriers themselves. From dealing with live vermin to pulling bad teeth, our next disgusting profession combined healthcare and dental in ways that would horrify modern medical professionals. Need a tooth pulled in medieval times? You weren't headed to a trained dentist, just someone with pliers and a strong stomach. Tooth drawers were the brave or foolish souls who handled medieval dental emergencies with tools that would make modern dentists faint. These practitioners had no formal training or education, just a set of crude metal pliers and perhaps a knife. Medieval dental school consisted entirely of watching someone else yank teeth, then saying, "I can do that," while desperately needing the money. When toothaches became unbearable, people would seek out these tooth drawers, who often worked in markets alongside other tradespeople. The procedure was brutally simple. Grip the offending tooth with pliers and pull with all your might. No anesthetic, no sterilization, and frequently no success on the first attempt. Some tooth drawers would offer alcohol to dull the pain, but many couldn't afford even this basic courtesy. The medieval equivalent of "this won't hurt a bit" was "try not to bite my fingers off while you're screaming." Infections were common. Broken teeth, damaged gums, and jaw injuries were standard outcomes. Many patients developed life-threatening abscesses after these crude extractions. The lucky ones merely lost more teeth than intended. To distract from the pain and attract customers, some tooth drawers became entertainers. They would perform extractions in public while telling jokes or singing songs, turning dental agony into a bizarre form of street theater. It was the medieval version of dinner and a show, except the dinner was blood and the show was your neighbor's anguish. From tanners to tooth drawers, the disgusting jobs of medieval times remind us how far we've come. Modern work might be stressful, but at least it doesn't involve standing ankle-deep in urine, blood, or someone else's extracted molars. Summer was hot and long in the Middle Ages. Without fans or cool air, people still found ways to stay cool. They used simple tricks that helped them handle the heat and get through each day. When the mercury climbed in medieval times, peasants couldn't exactly flip on the air conditioning. Instead, they completely rethought when and how they worked. Their morning alarm? The rooster, nature's most annoying snooze button that you can't turn off. Rise and shine happened incredibly early during heat waves. We're talking 4 or 5 in the morning. The air still held the coolness of night, and the sun hadn't yet turned the fields into nature's frying pan. If you think getting up for an 8 a.m. class is rough, imagine waking up at 4 a.m. without coffee. By starting so early, they could tackle the most physically demanding chores before the day turned brutal. Plowing and harvesting were exhausting even in good weather. Do that work at noon in 110-degree heat? That's not farming. That's self-barbecue. Studies show traditional farming communities can complete nearly 60% of their hardest labor before 10 a.m. during summer. When the clock struck around 11, everything changed. The hottest part of the day had arrived, and with it came what modern Spaniards call a siesta, though medieval peasants probably called it not dying of heat stroke time. From 11 until 3, the fields emptied out. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. Instead, peasants retreated to the coolest spots they could find. Finding the perfect shady spot was basically medieval air conditioning, except you had to chase the shadows as the sun moved. During these midday breaks, women might spin wool or prepare cool meals. Men might repair tools or weave baskets. Children might collect water from the well, a chore that medieval parents could pitch as, "At least you get to stand by the cool well while the rest of us sweat indoors." The medieval peasants' understanding of daily temperature patterns was remarkably accurate. Generations of experience had taught them exactly how the day would unfold. The Weather Channel would have had 0 viewers in medieval times. Everyone was already a weather expert by necessity. Around 3 or 4, as the worst heat began to ease, peasants emerged for a second shift of work. These later hours were for less strenuous activities, feeding animals, gathering eggs, or preparing the evening meal. This schedule wasn't a cultural preference. It was found across medieval Europe wherever high temperatures were a problem. From Spain to Hungary, peasants adopted similar patterns because they worked. When the sun set, sleep came early. After all, tomorrow would begin at dawn again. Nobody was staying up to binge-watch medieval Netflix, which would have just been a guy telling stories until everyone fell asleep anyway. Of course, changing when you worked wasn't the only trick medieval peasants had for beating the heat. Sometimes they needed to escape the sun completely. When the scorching heat became too much even with a clever daily schedule, medieval peasants had another cooling trick. They went underground. The earth itself became their natural refrigerator in the form of dugouts and cellars. These underground spaces weren't fancy, but what they lacked in style, they made up for in cooling power. These were the original basement man caves, except without the flat-screen TVs and dartboards. A dugout was exactly what it sounds like, a space dug into the earth, usually into a hillside when possible. These earth-sheltered rooms maintained a steady temperature year-round, typically hovering between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Even when the outside world was baking at over 100 degrees, these underground chambers stayed refreshingly cool. 6 feet below the surface, ground temperature remains nearly constant regardless of wild swings in air temperature above. Modern studies of traditional earth-sheltered homes show they can be up to 30 degrees cooler than the outside air during extreme heat waves without any mechanical cooling. Walking into a medieval dugout on a scorching day would feel like stepping into an air-conditioned supermarket, minus the awkward small talk with people from high school you're trying to avoid. Constructing these cool retreats took serious effort. Peasants would dig horizontally into a hillside or vertically down into flat ground. The walls were often lined with clay, stone, or packed dirt. Overhead, they used wooden beams, sometimes covered with layers of moss, thatch, or more dirt for insulation. The entrance typically faced north whenever possible, away from direct sunlight. Some dugouts even included primitive ventilation systems, small air shafts that created gentle air circulation without letting in heat. While food storage was their primary purpose, during heat waves, these underground spaces became literal lifesavers. Families might retreat to their root cellar during the hottest hours. Children were often sent to fetch items from the cellar, a chore that mysteriously had many volunteers during July and August. Many medieval homes also incorporated semi-subterranean designs, with floors dug several feet below ground level. In regions with extreme temperatures, some dwellings were built partially underground. These earth-bermed houses stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter, medieval climate control at its finest. The temperature difference could be dramatic. On days when the air temperature climbed to 110 degrees, the dugout might remain a comparatively chilly 60 degrees. A 50-degree difference achieved without a single watt of electricity. Medieval real estate agents would have had very different selling points. This lovely dugout features all-natural cooling, excellent root vegetable storage, and is conveniently located just 20 steps from your main pig pen. Archaeological evidence of these cooling structures exists across Europe, with particularly sophisticated examples in Mediterranean countries where summer heat was most severe. Some dugouts from this period show evidence of water channels running through or near them, adding evaporative cooling to their temperature-regulating qualities. Underground spaces helped medieval people beat the heat, but sometimes they needed cooling solutions that worked above ground too. Medieval peasants couldn't exactly throw on a tank top and shorts when temperatures soared, yet their clothing choices were surprisingly effective at managing heat, much more so than you might expect. The secret? It all started with linen. This wonder fabric made from the flax plant was the medieval equivalent of modern athletic wear. Almost every peasant owned at least one linen undergarment, a shirt for men or a chemise for women. These base layers served a crucial purpose. They absorbed sweat and allowed it to evaporate slowly, creating a natural cooling effect directly against the skin. When it came to summer wardrobes, medieval peasants were living the business on the outside, party on the inside lifestyle, centuries before the mullet haircut tried to claim it. Linen truly was a remarkable fabric for hot weather. Studies of traditional linen garments show they can feel up to 7 degrees cooler than modern cotton, and as much as 15 degrees cooler than polyester when worn in direct sunlight. The flax fibers have natural wicking properties that pull moisture away from the body. Over this base layer, peasants typically wore looser outer garments, often made of lightweight wool. Before you gasp at the thought of wool in summer, remember that not all wool is created equal. Medieval peasants used thin, loosely woven wool that breathed surprisingly well. The loose fit of these garments was intentional, not a fashion statement, but a cooling strategy. The space between clothing and skin allowed air to circulate, creating a microclimate that helped regulate body temperature. The counterintuitive brilliance of medieval summer clothing was that it actually covered most of the body. Long sleeves and hems protected skin from direct sunlight while still allowing sweat to evaporate. In regions with the hottest summers, clothing was often nearly all white or very light-colored, reflecting rather than absorbing the sun's rays. Head coverings were especially important cooling tools. Women wore lightweight linen veils or caps, while men donned straw hats or simple cloth caps with brims. Medieval peasants knew what modern dermatologists keep telling us: a good hat is worth 10 bottles of sunscreen, especially when your sunscreen options were basically olive oil or nothing. Footwear followed the same cooling principles. When possible, many peasants went barefoot during the hottest weather. Direct contact with cool earth or stone floors helped lower body temperature. For work requiring foot protection, Thin leather sandals or shoes with ventilation holes were common in summer months. Multiple thin layers that could be added or removed throughout the day meant peasants could adjust their clothing as temperature and activity levels changed. This modular approach to dressing is something modern outdoor enthusiasts still use for temperature regulation. Imagine a medieval fashion influencer. Today's summer look features my favorite twice-buck linen chemise paired with my artisanally loose-woven wool kirtle. Don't forget to subscribe to my illuminated manuscript for more hot weather tips. Medieval clothing choices showed remarkable ingenuity in managing heat. But fabric and fashion were just one piece of the survival puzzle. When the temperature truly soared, peasants turned to other clever strategies that made all the difference. Beyond schedules, dugouts, and clothing, medieval peasants developed specific habits that helped keep their bodies cool during extreme heat. These everyday techniques required no special tools, just an understanding of how the human body responds to temperature. One of the simplest yet most effective cooling habits was controlling movement. During the hottest parts of the day, peasants deliberately slowed their pace. Fast movements generate internal heat, while moving slowly reduces the body's heat production by as much as 30%. You could always spot the newcomers to a medieval village during a heat wave. They were the ones hurrying through tasks while the locals moved like they were swimming in honey. The way peasants positioned themselves was equally important. They frequently sat directly on cool surfaces like stone floors, packed dirt, or clay tiles. Direct contact with these cooler materials allowed body heat to transfer away through conduction, a process much more efficient than air cooling. For immediate relief, medieval people used wet cloths strategically placed on pulse points, especially the wrists, neck, and temples. Modern cooling research confirms that these specific body locations cool blood most effectively. A wet cloth on the neck can reduce core body temperature by nearly 1 degree in just minutes. A medieval mother applying cool cloths to her children's wrists during a heat wave was essentially using the same cooling technology as those fancy 21st century cooling wristbands, just without the marketing budget. Medieval people also mastered the art of finding and creating shade. They carefully mapped mental routes through their villages that maximized shade coverage. Pathways between buildings, under overhanging roofs, and beneath large trees became high-traffic areas during hot days. Breathing techniques played a role too. Medieval workers often practiced breathing through the nose rather than the mouth during hot weather. Nasal breathing humidifies and cools incoming air more effectively than mouth breathing. Going barefoot was common during extreme heat. This allowed direct contact with cooler ground surfaces and eliminated the heat trapped by footwear. For those working in fields or on rough terrain, thin sandals were removed whenever possible during rest periods. Knowledge of cooling routes and locations became valued community wisdom. Certain spots earned reputations as the coolest places in a village, often located where underground water ran close to the surface or where natural terrain features created consistent breezes. Medieval villages had their own cool kids table. It was literally wherever the temperature happened to be lowest that day. The accumulation of these small habits created a comprehensive approach to body cooling that required no technology beyond careful observation and generational knowledge. Medieval peasants might not have understood the thermodynamics behind their cooling techniques, but centuries of trial and error had perfected methods that worked remarkably well. These physical habits were just one part of a complete medieval cooling system. Beyond how they moved their bodies, peasants had additional clever tricks up their sweat-soaked sleeves. What you eat and drink can make you feel hotter or cooler. And medieval peasants knew this fact very well. Their food and beverage choices during heat waves weren't just about taste or hunger, they were strategic cooling decisions. Let's start with their drinks, because staying hydrated was just as important then as it is now. But medieval peasants couldn't just open the fridge for an ice-cold beverage. Instead, they relied on several clever alternatives. Small beer was a summer favorite across medieval Europe. Don't let the name fool you. This wasn't the strong stuff that got you drunk. Small beer was a very low alcohol drink, often less than 1%, brewed quickly and consumed while still young. During hot weather, it was kept cool in underground cellars or deep wells. The slight fermentation made it safer to drink than plain water from questionable sources, while the low alcohol content meant it hydrated rather than dehydrated the body. Medieval small beer was basically their version of sports drinks, minus the neon colors and million-dollar celebrity endorsements. Even more refreshing was Posca, a drink made from water mixed with vinegar and herbs like mint or sage. This ancient cooler dates back to Roman times and remained popular throughout the medieval period. The acidity from the vinegar helped prevent harmful bacteria growth, making it safer than plain water, while the slight sourness created a sensation of coolness on the tongue. Studies of traditional cooling drinks show that diluted vinegar beverages can create a cooling sensation that lasts up to 15 minutes after drinking. Many peasants also collected morning dew to drink. A surprisingly smart move. Water collected from plants just before dawn was naturally cool and relatively clean compared to stagnant water sources. Dew collection was often a task given to children, who would go out very early with clean cloths to wipe dew from large leaves, wringing the moisture into containers. For those near clean water sources, medieval people would submerge sealed clay jugs of drinking water in flowing streams, creating a natural cooling system that kept water 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the air temperature. Clay vessels themselves helped with cooling through evaporation, as small amounts of water seeped through the porous clay and evaporated from the outer surface. The contents inside stayed cooler. When it came to food, medieval peasants naturally gravitated toward cooling options during heat waves. They avoided using cooking fires during the hottest hours, which would have turned their small homes into ovens. Instead, they prepared dishes in the cool early morning hours that could be eaten at room temperature later. Cold soups made from pureed vegetables, stale bread, and herbs were common summer meals. These weren't just convenient, they were genuinely cooling to eat. Cucumber, sorrel, and borage were favorite ingredients for their naturally cooling properties. Medieval medical texts specifically recommended these foods for cooling the blood during hot weather, and modern nutritional science confirms these plants contain compounds that can create a cooling sensation. The medieval version of meals in minutes was grabbing cold pottage that had been sitting around all day. No microwave needed. It was already at the perfect temperature of not going to make me any hotter. Preservation techniques adapted during hot weather too. Summer cheeses were made smaller and less aged than winter varieties, requiring less salt and resulting in a higher moisture content, more hydrating during hot weather. Fruits like berries and early apples were often crushed and strained, then mixed with a little vinegar or whey to create refreshing fruit drinks that would keep for several days without spoiling. Spices played a surprising role in medieval cooling strategies. While we might think of spicy foods as warming, medieval people consumed certain herbs and spices specifically for their cooling effects. Mint was the cooling champion, added to everything from drinks to desserts during hot weather. They also used fennel seeds, coriander, and rose water, all believed to cool the stomach according to medieval medical texts. Medieval herb gardens were like their pharmacy, grocery store, and air conditioning system all rolled into one. Meal timing changed during heat waves as well. The heaviest meal of the day would shift to either very early morning or late evening when temperatures were lower. During the hottest part of the day, people ate light, moisture-rich foods that required minimal digestion, as they correctly observed that heavy digestion generates body heat. Food and drink were just part of the cooling puzzle. Medieval peasants had even more clever tricks for staying comfortable when the temperatures climbed to unbearable levels. Water was medieval Europe's most valuable cooling resource, second only to shade. While today we might take running water for granted, medieval peasants developed remarkably creative ways to use this precious liquid for temperature control. The most direct approach was also the most effective: get wet. Medieval peasants would often wade into streams, ponds, or rivers during extreme heat, but with a twist that modern swimmers might find strange. They frequently kept their clothes on while doing so. This wasn't about modesty, it was about extended cooling. Wet garments, especially linen, would continue to cool through evaporation long after leaving the water. Records from several medieval heat waves describe entire villages spending midday hours partially submerged in nearby waterways. In regions where natural water bodies weren't available, communal cooling pools were sometimes excavated specifically for summer use. These simple basins, often lined with clay, collected rainwater or diverted stream water for cooling purposes. Medieval swimming lessons were pretty straightforward. Step 1, find water. Step 2, get in. Congratulations, you've graduated. Just try not to drown. For those who couldn't leave work to take a dip, a quick head or foot dunking provided targeted relief. The head, feet, and hands lose heat faster than other body parts due to their extensive blood vessels close to the skin. Medieval workers would often keep a bucket of water nearby just for occasional hand or foot immersion. Wet cloths were another universal cooling tool. Testing of traditional cooling methods shows that a damp cloth at the back of the neck can lower perceived temperature by up to 8 degrees. Medieval peasants would drape wet cloths around their necks or over their heads, refreshing them whenever they dried out. Drawing water from deep wells was another cooling strategy with dual benefits. Well water pulled from depths of 30 feet or more maintains a constant cool temperature of about 55 degrees year-round. Not only was this water refreshing to drink, but the containers themselves became cooling tools. Getting assigned to water fetching duty during a medieval heat wave was like winning the lottery. Oh no, I have to go to the cool, shaded well again. What a terrible chore. Home cooling relied heavily on water too. One widespread technique involved hanging dampened cloths over doorways and windows. As breezes passed through these moistened barriers, the air was cooled through evaporation. This primitive evaporative cooling could drop indoor temperatures by several degrees in dry climates. Clay water containers played a dual role in home cooling. Unglazed clay pots allowed small amounts of water to seep through and evaporate from the outer surface, cooling the remaining water inside. These porous vessels were often placed at strategic points around living spaces to create cool microzones within a home. Some medieval homes in hotter regions incorporated architectural water features. Shallow water channels might run along the perimeter of a main room, slightly cooling the air through evaporation. In more sophisticated dwellings, these channels might even connect to an external water source, creating a constant cooling flow throughout the living space. Floors were sprinkled with water multiple times daily during extreme heat, with the evaporation providing additional cooling. Sleeping mats and beds were sometimes dampened before use, though only enough to cool without becoming uncomfortably wet. In communal areas, shade and water combined to create cooling zones. Trees that cast dense shade were often chosen as sites for community wells or water storage, creating naturally air-conditioned gathering spots. For outdoor work that couldn't be paused during heat, water-soaked canopies would be erected to provide both shade and evaporative cooling. Medieval pest control and cooling were sometimes achieved simultaneously. The same water sprinkled on floors for cooling would also keep down dust and discourage insects. Talk about multitasking. Medieval water cooling techniques weren't just clever, they were surprisingly effective. Modern recreations of these methods show they can reduce perceived temperature by 15 degrees or more in hot, dry conditions. These water-based approaches, combined with all their other cooling strategies, made surviving even the most extreme heat waves possible without any modern technology. The medieval toolkit for beating extreme heat was remarkably complete. From dawn to dusk scheduling to underground retreats, from specially designed clothing to strategic body cooling, from carefully chosen foods to creative uses of water, medieval peasants had assembled a comprehensive heat survival system through centuries of practical experience. Medieval peasants are often seen as poor and struggling all the time. But is that the full story? Before you decide, it helps to take a closer look at what their lives were really like, beyond the usual stories everyone knows. When we think of medieval peasants, we often picture starving people eating dirt and bugs to survive. But the truth is a bit different. Their meals weren't fancy 5-course dinners, but they weren't constantly on the edge of starvation either. The daily diet of a medieval peasant centered around bread. Lots and lots of bread. Unlike our fluffy white supermarket loaves, peasant bread was dark, dense, and made from whatever grains grew locally. Rye and barley were common, with wheat reserved for the wealthy. A typical peasant might eat 1 to 2 pounds of bread every single day. That's like eating an entire modern loaf by yourself. Porridge was another staple, cheap, filling, and easy to make. Just throw some oats or barley into a pot with water, and you've got yourself a meal. Beans, peas, onions, garlic, and turnips rounded out the daily fare. These vegetables were usually grown in small garden plots right next to the peasant's home. Would you like some meat with your bread? Sorry, we're fresh out. How about some more bread instead? This joke would have made perfect sense to a medieval peasant. Meat was special, not an everyday thing. Most peasants might enjoy meat only during feast days or special occasions, perhaps 40 to 50 days a year if they were lucky. Pork was the most common, as pigs were relatively easy to raise on scraps and forage in nearby woods. Fresh fish was available to those who lived near rivers or the coast. But for inland peasants, salted herring became a crucial protein source, especially during Lent when church rules forbade meat. One interesting food fact: eggs were more accessible than meat, providing crucial protein when meat wasn't available. Now, about drinks, water wasn't always trusted, and for good reason. It could make you sick. Instead, ale was the everyday drink for everyone, including children. Records from medieval England show that an adult male laborer could drink up to a gallon of ale daily. Before you picture drunk peasants stumbling around fields, know that medieval ale was weaker than modern beer. Though still, those farming fields with a slight buzz might explain some of the crooked rows. Preparing medieval meals was no quick drive-through experience. A peasant woman, because cooking was almost always women's work, might spend hours each day just making bread. First grinding grain by hand, mixing dough, letting it rise, then baking in a communal oven or under hot ashes at home. Compare that to our 2-minute microwave meals. During good harvest years, this diet provided enough calories to sustain hard physical labor, but one bad harvest could change everything. Crop failures due to weather or war meant serious hunger. Food security was always uncertain. Medieval accounts describe desperate measures during famines, grinding tree bark into flour or boiling leather to make soup. Seasons dramatically affected what was available. Late winter and early spring, known as the Hungry Gap, were especially tough when stored food was running low and new crops weren't ready. Fall, right after harvest, brought relative abundance. One medieval festival tradition involved baking extraordinarily large loaves of bread after the grain harvest, some reportedly weighing over 40 pounds. The foods that filled peasant bellies sustained them through harsh times and grueling work. While their bread-heavy meals might seem boring to our modern tastes, this simple diet was the foundation that kept medieval life going. But food was only one part of daily survival. Let's talk about medieval peasant homes. They weren't exactly featured in Better Homes and Gardens. A typical peasant house was tiny by today's standards, usually just 1 or 2 rooms where an entire family lived together. These weren't spacious open-concept layouts with walk-in closets and ensuite bathrooms. The basic structure started with a wooden frame made from whatever trees grew nearby. Pine, oak, elm, anything that could be cut down and shaped would do. Next came the walls, which were mostly wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks woven together like a basket, then covered with mud mixed with straw, dung, and clay. This mixture dried hard and provided decent insulation against cold winds. Floors, nothing but hard-packed earth. Wall-to-wall carpeting meant scattered rushes or straw that caught all manner of dirt, crumbs, and little presents from the family dog. These floor coverings were changed only a few times a year, creating what must have been quite the aromatic experience. For the roof, bundles of straw, reeds, or whatever waterproof plant material was available were layered and tied together. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years if maintained properly, but it also made a cozy home for mice, bugs, and birds. The peak of the roof often had a hole to let smoke escape from the fire below. Speaking of fire, heating and cooking happened around an open hearth right in the middle of the main room. No chimneys existed in most peasant homes until the late Middle Ages. Smoke would fill the upper part of the house before finding its way out through the roof hole or just seeping through the thatch. Windows were rare luxuries. Most homes had just small openings that might be covered with oiled paper, cloth, or wooden shutters during bad weather. Glass windows, those were for churches and rich folks. Medieval peasants could truthfully say they didn't need fancy curtains because they barely had walls. In winter, things got even more crowded when animals were brought inside. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs might share the space with humans. This wasn't because medieval peasants were especially fond of their livestock. It was simply practical. Animals generated body heat, keeping the house warmer, and it also prevented valuable animals from freezing to death or being stolen. Privacy didn't exist in these homes. Entire families slept in one room, often sharing a single large bed filled with straw. Children might sleep at the foot of their parents' bed or on the floor nearby. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were unwelcome but ever-present roommates. A fascinating fact. Studies of preserved medieval homes show that the average peasant dwelling in England was about 400 square feet. That's smaller than many modern studio apartments. A family of 5 to 8 people might live in this space together. Storage space was creative and limited. Ropes stretched across rafters held drying herbs and meat. Baskets hung from walls contained essential tools. Every inch of space needed a purpose, and nothing was wasted. These humble dwellings kept peasants mostly sheltered from weather and wild animals, but they were constantly in need of repair. After shelter and food came another daily concern. Money talks, even in medieval times. But how much did a hard day's work actually pay for a peasant? Let's break down the medieval economy in terms we can all understand. Most peasants worked the land. From sunrise to sunset, they plowed fields, planted crops, harvested grain, and tended to animals. The work was backbreaking and constant, with different tasks depending on the season. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer brought weeding and maintenance. Fall was harvest time. Winter involved repairs, spinning wool, and other indoor tasks. For those who weren't tied to farming, other job options existed. Skilled trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, tanning, and weaving offered alternatives. Women often worked as brewers, bakers, or spinners alongside their household duties. Children as young as 7 started working, usually helping their parents or serving as apprentices. Now, for the big question, what did they earn? A typical unskilled laborer in England around the 1300s might make 1 or 2 pennies per day. Skilled workers earned more. Carpenters and blacksmiths could command 3 to 4 pennies daily. For context, a single penny then had much more purchasing power than our modern coins. What could a medieval penny buy? A decent loaf of bread cost about half a penny. A chicken would set you back 2 pennies. A gallon of that everyday ale went for roughly 1 penny. Cloth for a simple shirt might cost 3 or 4 pennies. Medieval budget advisors would have had a simple tip sheet. Monday, buy bread. Tuesday through Sunday, good luck. Most peasants lived close to the edge financially. One bad harvest or unexpected expense could push a family into debt or worse. Paying for things worked differently back then. Actual coins were used less frequently than you might expect. Instead, many workers received payment in goods like food, housing, or the right to use land. A blacksmith might fix a farmer's plow in exchange for grain. A laborer might work extra days for the lord of the manor to pay rent on his small cottage. The concept of wages as we know them was still developing. Many peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They didn't receive salaries, but instead kept a portion of what they produced after giving the required amount to their lord. This system, called manorialism, meant your economic situation was largely determined by birth. Records from medieval England give us fascinating details about pay rates. After the Black Death killed nearly half the population in the mid-1300s, surviving laborers suddenly found themselves in high demand. Wages increased dramatically, in some cases doubling or tripling. This labor shortage alarmed authorities so much that England's King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Like many minimum wage laws through history, workers found creative ways around these restrictions faster than you can say under-the-table payment. Court records show frequent fines for workers who demanded higher pay than legally allowed. One mason in Oxford was caught accepting excessive wages of 5 pennies daily plus meals, a medieval version of salary plus benefits. While their homes offered basic shelter and their diets provided just enough nutrition, medieval peasants' wages gave them little opportunity to improve their situation. Yet surviving on these meager earnings was just one of many challenges they faced in their daily lives. There was more to medieval peasant existence than just working all day and counting pennies at night. Hard as it may be to believe, medieval peasants weren't working every single hour of their lives. They actually had days off, and more of them than you might expect. No, they weren't spending their free time scrolling through Ye Old Book or playing angry peasants on their stone tablets. The medieval work calendar revolved around religion. Sundays were mandatory rest days according to church law. Working on the Lord's Day could get you in serious trouble with both heavenly and earthly authorities. This weekly break gave peasants a day to attend church, rest their bodies, and spend time with family. But Sundays were just the beginning. The medieval calendar was packed with religious holidays and saints' days, somewhere between 40 and 50 days per year when work was forbidden. Add these to Sundays, and medieval peasants enjoyed roughly 1 day off for every 3 they worked. Major religious festivals like Christmas and Easter stretched across multiple days. For example, the Christmas celebration lasted 12 days, from December 25th to January 6th. During these periods, much regular work stopped completely. What did peasants do with this free time? For starters, they drank. A lot. Village alehouses served as the medieval equivalent of community centers where people gathered to gossip, sing, play games, and yes, consume impressive amounts of ale. Medieval drinking songs were probably the original karaoke, just as loud and just as off-key, but with more verses about farming. Physical games were incredibly popular. Medieval football looked nothing like modern soccer. It was a chaotic free-for-all where entire villages competed to move a ball from one landmark to another. Think of it as soccer meets rugby meets a tavern brawl, minus the yellow cards, but with extra bruises. With no referee and very few rules, these matches often ended with broken bones and bloody noses. Authorities repeatedly tried to ban these games because they were too violent and distracted people from archery practice, which was actually useful for national defense. Wrestling matches drew crowds of spectators. Strong young men would grapple and throw each other to prove their strength and win small prizes or just bragging rights. Records show that accidental deaths during these wrestling matches weren't uncommon. For less violent entertainment, peasants enjoyed music and dancing. Professional traveling musicians were rare treats, but many villages had talented locals who played pipes, drums, or stringed instruments. Simple circle dances would break out at festivals, with everyone from children to grandparents joining in. Storytelling filled winter evenings. With no television or internet, oral traditions thrived. Tales of heroes, saints, monsters, and magic passed down through generations. The medieval version of Netflix was just Grandpa by the fire, telling the same dragon story for the 100th time. And nobody could skip to the next episode. These weren't just entertainment. They preserved cultural values and practical knowledge. A fascinating fact, church records show complaints about peasants skipping Mass to attend plays or games, suggesting that even with limited options, medieval people still found ways to avoid boring obligations in favor of fun. Seasonal activities dotted the calendar. Spring brought maypole dances, where villagers wrapped a tall pole with ribbons while dancing in circles. Midsummer celebrations featured bonfires that people would jump over for good luck. Harvest festivals included competitions for the best crops and feasts where everyone contributed food. While modern historians once believed medieval peasants lived lives of unrelenting misery, evidence from court records, church complaints, and archaeological findings tell a different story. These people worked incredibly hard, but they also played hard during their time off. These moments of rest and celebration helped peasants cope with the harsh realities of medieval life. The ability to occasionally step away from work, share joy with neighbors, and forget their troubles for a moment was crucial. Of course, when the festivities ended, they returned to a world filled with other daily challenges that required different kinds of strength to overcome. When we picture medieval peasants, we often imagine filthy people who never bathed. Movies show them with blackened teeth and covered in muck. But is that really accurate? The answer might surprise you. First off, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses were common in towns until the late Middle Ages. People understood that cleaning themselves felt good and helped prevent certain illnesses. Many households had wooden tubs they'd fill with heated water for washing. During summer, streams and rivers served as natural bathing spots. Sir, your bath is ready. We've warmed the water to a perfect temperature of whatever temperature water happens to be when you carry it from the, bath time wasn't as convenient as turning on a faucet, but it existed. The idea that medieval folks avoided water completely is simply wrong. What about dental hygiene? Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist, but people still cleaned their teeth. They'd rub them with rough cloth, sometimes using mixtures of herbs, salt, or even crushed charcoal as an early form of toothpaste. Mouthwashes made from herbs like sage and mint helped freshen breath. These methods weren't perfect, but they weren't nothing either. That said, health problems were abundant. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries could become deadly if infected. A simple cut while working in the fields might lead to blood poisoning. Broken bones, if not set properly, could cause lifelong disability. Disease was the greatest threat. The Black Death famously killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-1300s. But everyday illnesses took even more lives over time. Influenza, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread quickly in crowded living conditions. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Many women died during delivery or from infections afterward. This partly explains why medieval women often had many pregnancies. Sadly, not all children survived to adulthood. Records from English villages show that for every 5 children born, only 2 or 3 might reach age 10. Medical treatment was a mix of practical knowledge and what we'd call superstition today. Got a headache? Your local healer might suggest a mix of willow bark tea, which contains natural aspirin, and wearing a special stone around your neck, which contains zero medicine whatsoever. Surprisingly, some medieval surgeons were quite skilled. They could set bones, remove bladder stones, and even perform basic eye surgery for cataracts. Most operations happened without anesthesia, though alcohol or opium sometimes dulled the pain. One common misconception involves medieval life expectancy. We often hear that people only live to be 30 or 40 years old. This is technically true, but misleading. The average was dragged down by extremely high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a decent chance of seeing 50 or 60 years, not so different from more recent history before modern medicine. Evidence from cemetery excavations shows many medieval peasants suffered from arthritis, likely from years of hard physical labor. Dental problems were common too, though not primarily from lack of cleaning. Coarse bread wore down teeth, and without dental care, any damage was permanent. The harsh realities of disease, injury, and limited medical knowledge meant medieval peasants faced health challenges at every turn. Yet even with these struggles, they still had to deal with another constant pressure in their lives. You think your taxes are bad? Let's talk about medieval money troubles. The medieval tax system wasn't just complicated, it was designed to extract as much as possible from those who had the least to give. Peasants lived under a constant reign of financial demands. First came rent to their lords. Most peasants didn't own their land outright. Instead, they held it from a noble lord and paid for that privilege, usually with a combination of money, crops, and labor. This wasn't a simple monthly payment. The amount could change based on harvests, the lord's needs, or simply because the lord said so. Next came the church tithe, a mandatory 10% of everything a peasant produced. That's right, 1/10 of all crops, animals, and products went straight to the church. And this wasn't optional or tax deductible. Church representatives would actually come to inspect your harvest to make sure you weren't holding back. Good news! The church only wants 10% of your crops. The bad news? Your lord wants the other 90%. This wasn't far from the truth for many medieval peasants. Random fees popped up constantly throughout a peasant's life. Need to use the lord's mill to grind your grain? That'll cost you. Want to marry? There's a fee for that. Did someone in your family die? Time to pay the Harriet, a death tax where the lord took your best animal or tool. The most unusual fees came from strange medieval customs. For example, in some places, peasants had to pay a merchet when their daughters married, essentially compensating the lord for the loss of a worker. In other areas, lords had the right of first dibs on anything a peasant wanted to sell. What happens if you can't pay? The consequences were harsh. You might lose your land rights, be forced into extra labor, or even face imprisonment. Debt wasn't seen as an unfortunate circumstance, but as a moral failing and crime. Medieval records tell tales of creative payment methods when coins were scarce. One Yorkshire peasant paid his taxes with a bundle of arrows he had crafted. A family in Normandy settled their debt with their lord by providing him with a large cheese every autumn for 7 years. The total tax burden could be crushing. Studies of medieval English manners suggest peasants might surrender 20 to 30% of everything they produced through various payments. This doesn't sound drastically different from modern tax rates until you remember that medieval peasants were already living at subsistence level. Every egg taken in tax was an egg not feeding their children. Medieval tax collectors were the original inspiration for horror stories. Look out! Here Comes the Lord Steward was scarier than any ghost tale. Seasonal payments created another layer of stress. Most fees came due after harvest when peasants had crops to sell or trade. A poor harvest meant impossible choices between paying taxes or feeding your family. Court records reveal that peasants developed sophisticated strategies for managing these financial pressures. Some formed informal lending networks within villages. Others specialized in craft production they could sell for coins. Many simply negotiated payment plans or begged for mercy from their lords. The financial pressure cooker of medieval peasant life shaped every decision, from what crops to plant to how many children to have. Yet through all these hardships, medieval peasants found ways to survive and occasionally thrive, creating communities and traditions that would last for centuries, leaving a legacy that still influences our world today. Living in a medieval castle was great if you were the king. Warm fires, roasted meat, people bowing wherever you walked. But for everyone else, without a crown or a throne. Castle life was cold, cramped, and full of hard work. Let's take a look at what they had to deal with. Let's start with the ones wearing jewels and velvet. The unfortunate noble ladies spent their days wrapped in clothing that would make modern torture devices seem comfortable. Every morning began with servants strapping them into tight corsets that squeezed their organs into new shapes. Then came the layers. Not 2 or 3, but often 5 or more separate pieces of clothing weighing up to 50 pounds total. Talk about the world's worst workout outfit. All day, every day, with no shower afterward. Summer brought no relief. While peasants could at least strip down to lighter garments, noble ladies kept those suffocating layers. Records show that several ladies in waiting fainted during particularly hot summer feasts in the 1300s. One French noblewoman's diary complained of spending July drowning in my own sweat beneath velvet that feels like hellfire. Their daily activities weren't much better than their wardrobe situation. Noble ladies spent hours upon hours learning skills that served almost no practical purpose. Embroidery with gold thread, playing the lute with proper finger placement, and memorizing hundreds of prayers in Latin, a language most couldn't even understand. Their education prepared them for one thing only, to be decorative and obedient. Most castle ladies couldn't read beyond basic prayers, couldn't manage finances, and certainly couldn't choose their own husbands. Marriages were arranged when girls were as young as 7 years old, with the actual wedding happening once they hit 12 or 13. Nothing says childhood like meeting your future husband when you're still playing with dolls. Freedom? Not a chance. Castle ladies rarely left their designated spaces. They spent days in the solar, a slightly less drafty room where they sewed by inadequate light until their eyes strained. Many developed terrible posture and eyesight by their 20s. Venture too far, and they'd be scolded for impropriety. Go outside? Only with permission, guards, and proper covering. Their most important job was producing children, specifically male heirs. Medieval medical texts show that women were blamed for all fertility problems. One treatise advised that if a woman couldn't conceive, she should be fed weird concoctions including powdered rabbit womb and crushed deer antlers. If she had only daughters, clearly she wasn't trying hard enough. The noble lady might have had jewelry and servants, but she lived in a prison of expectations, discomfort, and boredom. Her golden chains were just as binding as iron ones. Being at the top of castle life meant having the fanciest cage, with the best view of everyone else's misery. And while she sat in her solar counting stitches for the 1,000th time, elsewhere in the castle, others were facing their own unique versions of medieval suffering. Castle kitchen servants endured a special kind of hell. Their day began long before sunrise, when most castle residents were still snoring. By 4 in the morning, they were already hauling firewood, stoking flames, and preparing for the endless cooking demands of the day ahead. Medieval castle kitchens were basically fire hazards with roofs. Located far from the main hall to reduce fire risk, these sweltering chambers contained multiple hearths that burned constantly, raising temperatures to over 100 degrees. The only people in the castle who didn't need extra layers in winter were the kitchen servants. They were practically cooking themselves along with the food. The work never stopped. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and endless snacks for nobles who might decide they wanted a roasted peacock at midnight. Records from the 1300s show that large castle kitchens could serve up to 500 people daily, requiring kitchen servants to prepare dozens of different dishes for each meal. One medieval English castle went through over 2,000 loaves of bread and 23 barrels of ale in a single week. Burns, cuts, and injuries came with the job. Kitchens had stone floors that became slippery with grease, making falls common. Heavy pots could weigh up to 40 pounds when full, and dropping one meant both a mess and a beating. Medieval kitchen tools included massive meat hooks, razor-sharp cleavers, and cooking spits big enough to skewer an entire deer. The smells were a unique form of torture. Imagine the stench of poorly preserved meat, rotting vegetables, and smoke. All day, every day. Castle kitchens rarely had proper ventilation, so servants breathed in smoke until their lungs burned and their eyes watered. Their clothes smelled so bad that they weren't allowed to walk through certain parts of the castle, as if the nobles might die from commoner stink. The cruelest part? Kitchen servants rarely got to enjoy the food they slaved over. They ate scraps, burnt edges, and the cheapest ingredients. While they roasted exotic birds stuffed with spices for the Lord's table, their own meals consisted of watery porridge and stale bread. One medieval account describes kitchen boys fighting over the bones left over from the noble's feast just to suck out any remaining marrow. Their hands were permanently stained, their skin marked with burns, and their backs bent from endless hours of stirring, chopping, and carrying. And when the noble diners complained about food being too salty or not fancy enough, guess who took the blame? While the kitchen may have been a smoky inferno of endless work, at least these servants understood their role. Their suffering was straightforward, unlike others in the castle who faced different kinds of medieval misery with far more complicated rules. Speaking of complicated rules, no one had it worse than the young page boys of medieval castles. Childhood? Forget about it. For noble boys, growing up meant being shipped off to another lord's castle at 7 years old. 7. Modern kids that age are losing teeth and learning multiplication. Medieval boys were losing their families and learning how to serve strangers. The day began brutally early. Page boys were up before dawn, preparing their master's clothes, polishing boots, and fetching water. Their sleeping arrangements? Often just a thin mat on the floor of a hallway or antechamber. Medieval records show that in winter, page boys would sleep huddled together for warmth, sometimes taking turns staying awake to keep the fire going. Training was harsh and constant. These children had to master proper table manners, how to serve food without spilling, and memorize complex rules of etiquette. One wrong move, like pouring wine with your left hand instead of your right, could earn you a smack that would have modern parents calling lawyers faster than you can say child abuse. The education wasn't just about service, though. Pages spent hours each day learning skills for their future as knights, horse riding, sword fighting, and wrestling. Many suffered serious injuries during training. Medical records from one French castle documented 3 broken arms, 2 skull fractures, and countless bruises among pages in a single year. These weren't playground accidents. They were considered necessary toughening up. Pages also became professional sneaks and spies. Lords often used these children to gather information, sending them to eavesdrop on conversations or carry secret messages. The small size of young boys made them perfect for hiding in shadows and slipping through castle corridors unnoticed. The downside? Getting caught meant punishment for everyone involved, and medieval punishments were creative in the worst ways. Food was another sore spot. Pages were typically last to eat, getting whatever remained after knights and nobles had taken their fill. They had to stand during meals, sometimes for hours, watching others eat while their own stomachs growled. Nothing builds character like watching a fat lord stuff his face with roast goose while you wait for permission to eat crusty bread. Homesickness was crushing. Many page boys cried themselves to sleep during their first months away from home. Letters were rare, and visits home even rarer. Some wouldn't see their families for years. Records show that roughly 1 in 5 pages never completed their training. They either ran away, fell ill, or died from accidents. The most skilled pages would eventually graduate to becoming squires, a promotion that promised greater status but delivered mostly greater expectations. The higher you climbed in castle society, the fancier your problems became. Fancy problems indeed awaited those who reached knighthood. Despite all the romantic tales and heroic songs, being a medieval knight wasn't exactly a dream job. Let's start with their iconic armor, that shiny metal outfit that looked so impressive in tapestries. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 45 to 60 pounds. Wearing it was like carrying a third grader strapped to your body all day long. Summer fights were especially brutal. Knights would sweat so much inside their metal casings that they could lose up to 2 gallons of water during a single battle. Many passed out not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. One medieval medical text advised pouring cold water over a knight's head before battle, not for blessing, but to prevent them from cooking inside their own armor. Knights didn't die in battle so much as they were slowly steamed like medieval lobsters. The discomfort didn't end with temperature issues. Chafing was a knight's constant companion. Their underpadding, called an accaton or gambeson, was essentially a thick quilted jacket worn beneath the armor to prevent metal from digging into skin. But after hours of riding and fighting, these padded garments would become sweat-soaked torture devices, creating painful rashes that could become infected. Training was a lifelong commitment that started around age 7 as a page, continued through the teenage years as a squire, and finally culminated in knighthood, typically in their early 20s. By the time a man became a knight, he'd already spent more than half his life preparing for it. Archaeological studies of knight remains show distinctive bone deformations from years of sword practice and horse riding, their bodies literally molded by their profession. Then there was the constant expectation of violence. Knights were essentially medieval soldiers on permanent standby. When their lord called, they had to drop everything and fight, even in conflicts they didn't understand or support. Historical records show that many knights went into crushing debt trying to meet their military obligations. A typical knight's equipment could cost the equivalent of a small house in today's money, and they had to provide their own. Jousting, the glamorous sport of knights, was deadly serious. Lances were designed to shatter on impact to reduce fatalities, but deaths were still common. Medical records from tournaments show horrific injuries, broken necks, punctured lungs, shattered jaws. Even victorious knights often walked away with concussions that would bench a modern football player for a season. The average professional jousting career lasted about as long as a mayfly, if the knight was lucky. The code of chivalry created impossible standards too. Knights were expected to be fierce warriors, yet gentle courtiers, loyal to their lord, yet defenders of the weak, ruthless in battle, yet merciful to the defeated. Living with these contradictions drove many to crisis. Medieval literature is filled with knights questioning their purpose and suffering what we now recognize as PTSD. While knights worried about honor and glory, someone else handled the unglamorous business of keeping the castle from falling into complete chaos. Who exactly kept medieval chaos at bay? Meet the castle constable, the medieval equivalent of a building manager, security chief, and human complaint box, all rolled into one miserable package. While knights gallivanted off to glory, constables stayed behind to handle the endless, thankless work of making sure the castle didn't fall apart or get conquered while everyone was sleeping. The constable's day never really ended. Dawn to dusk, try dusk to dawn to dusk again. These poor souls were responsible for organizing guard rotations, maintaining the physical structure of the castle, managing food stores, and ensuring that weapons remained in working order. Medieval records from one English castle show that a constable was expected to inspect the entire perimeter walls twice daily, a walk of over 2 miles, often in terrible weather. Security was their greatest headache. A breach in castle defenses wasn't just a job failure. It meant death for potentially everyone inside. Constables lived with this pressure constantly. They checked every guard post, supervised the raising and lowering of drawbridges, and personally held the keys to the most important gates and doors. One medieval text advised constables to sleep with castle keys tied to their wrists to prevent theft, because nothing says restful sleep like 2 pounds of iron jangling against your face all night. The job came with impossible expectations. If anything went wrong, from a leaky roof to an enemy attack, the constable took the blame. Medieval castle accounts contain endless examples of constables being fined for everything from insufficient vigilance to allowing a torch to go out on the east wall. One unfortunate constable in France was held responsible when a storm damaged the castle's grain stores, as if he personally invited the lightning. The thankless tasks never stopped. Constables conducted inspections of the food supplies, interrogated suspicious visitors, and settled disputes among castle staff. They enforced the Lord's justice within the castle walls, which meant collecting fines and handing out punishments. Not exactly the way to win popularity contests in medieval society. Medieval records show constables were second only to tax collectors in receiving death threats from angry peasants. Living quarters revealed the constable's awkward middle status. Not quite noble enough to dine at the Lord's table, yet not common enough to relax among the servants. Many constables had small private chambers, usually positioned near castle entrances or armories, convenient for work, terrible for sleep. Historical records show that the average constable lasted only 4 to 6 years before asking to be relieved, either from stress, exhaustion, or the endless complaints. Perhaps the worst part was the constant undermining from above. Lords would override constable decisions, yet still hold them responsible for the outcomes. Knights would bypass security protocols, then blame the constable when problems arose. Servants would ignore maintenance schedules, then complain when equipment failed. At least the constable had a room to themselves, unlike those who experienced the most notorious area of castle life. The constable might have had sleepless nights worrying about castle security, but far below others experienced a darkness that went beyond mere shadows. Darkness had many meanings in medieval castles, but none more literal than life in the dungeons. These weren't the tidy cell blocks shown in movies. Medieval castle dungeons were often converted storage rooms, dried-up wells, or purpose-built pits designed to make human existence as miserable as possible. What got you thrown into these nightmare spaces? Almost anything. Debt was a common reason. Fail to pay what you owe, and down you went until your family scraped together enough money. Political disagreements with the local lord? That was good for a few months in darkness. Accused of theft without proper proof? The dungeon waited for you. Medieval justice wasn't big on innocent until proven guilty. It leaned more toward guilty until you confess or die, whichever comes first. The physical conditions defied human endurance. Most dungeons had no windows, no light, and no heating. Stone walls wept with constant moisture, creating the perfect breeding ground for mold and disease. Floors were rarely more than packed dirt, often saturated with waste from previous prisoners. Medieval dungeon maintenance consisted of occasionally throwing down straw, less for prisoner comfort and more to soak up the mess so the smell wouldn't reach the upper floors. Sleeping arrangements? There weren't any. If you were lucky, you might have straw. Unlucky prisoners slept directly on damp stone or dirt. Bedding was virtually non-existent except for the wealthiest prisoners who could pay for such luxuries. Rats were your constant companions, bold enough to nibble on sleeping prisoners. One medieval account describes prisoners tying their hair up at night to prevent rats from chewing it off while they slept. Food came irregularly and was barely edible when it arrived. In many castles, feeding prisoners wasn't considered the lord's responsibility. Family members had to bring food or pay the guards to provide it. No family or money? You might get a crust of bread and water every couple of days, just enough to keep you alive for more questioning. Records from one English castle show that the average prisoner lost 20 to 30 pounds during a typical 3-month confinement. Medical care didn't exist. Cut yourself on a rusty chain? Develop a fever from drinking filthy water? Tough luck. Infection was a common cause of death among dungeon prisoners. One medieval medical text described dungeon fever as the sickness that comes from breathing the air where many unwashed bodies have dwelled in darkness. Doctors rarely visited prisoners unless they were valuable hostages worth keeping alive. The psychological torture may have been worst of all. With no sense of time, no human contact beyond occasional guard visits, and no knowledge of when or if release might come, many prisoners simply lost their minds. The total darkness, constant dripping water, and distant sounds of castle life continuing above created a disorienting nightmare that broke even the strongest spirits. At least these wretched souls had someone checking on them occasionally. In the midst of all this suffering, various castle inhabitants turned to the only person who supposedly had a direct line to divine mercy: the castle priest. These men of God found themselves in perhaps the most awkward position in the entire feudal system. They were supposed to be messengers of heavenly authority, yet completely dependent on earthly lords for their daily bread. Talk about job insecurity. One sermon against gluttony, and suddenly the priest finds himself preaching to squirrels in the forest. Castle priests began their days before sunrise with early morning prayers. Medieval religious schedules required multiple prayer services throughout the day. Prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. That meant the priest was working before everyone else woke up and still murmuring Latin prayers when the guards changed for night watch. Medieval priests didn't need alarm clocks. Eternal salvation anxiety did the trick just fine. In theory, priests held moral authority over even the castle lord. In practice, criticizing your food provider was dangerous business. Records show multiple cases of priests being dismissed from their positions for daring to scold noble patrons about their less than holy behavior. One English priest was thrown out for suggesting the Lord's drinking habits were excessive. His replacement learned to look the other way when wine flowed freely. Holy water for the chapel, wine for the Lord, and blind eyes for the priest. The job description kept expanding in bizarre ways. Beyond spiritual duties of prayer, confession, and communion, priests were expected to perform an endless list of religious tasks for superstitious castle inhabitants. They blessed swords before battle, shields before tournaments, bread before baking, beds before births, and for some reason were always called to inspect strange mold on the wall that someone thought looked like a saint's face. Confession duty created the most uncomfortable moments. Castle priests heard every secret, scandal, and sin from everyone, but were unable to act on any of it due to the sacred seal of confession. One French manuscript mentions a castle priest who developed a facial twitch from the stress of holding in so many secrets. Medieval castle priests were essentially therapists without degrees, confidants without choice, and the only men in the castle who might actually prefer deafness as a career advantage. During times of crisis, priests faced impossible demands. When disease struck, they were expected to visit the sick despite the risk. When food grew scarce, they were supposed to explain why God allowed hunger. When battles went poorly, they had to justify divine plans that included defeat. If too many children died in winter, if crops failed in summer, somehow the priest needed to have a theological explanation ready. While the priest struggled with these spiritual burdens, at least he didn't have to deal with the castle's most disgusting problems directly. Every castle's worst job belonged to the gong farmer, the unfortunate soul responsible for removing human waste from the castle's privies and cesspits. Medieval toilets, called garderobes, were basically holes that dropped waste directly down the castle walls or into collection pits. After months or years of use, someone had to clean them out. Enter the gong farmer. These brave workers crawled into narrow waste chutes armed with shovels, buckets, and strong stomachs. They collected night soil, the polite term for human excrement, and hauled it outside the castle walls for disposal. Medieval castles produced roughly 50 pounds of human waste daily, meaning gong farmers literally dealt with tons of crap every year. The job paid surprisingly well for obvious reasons. Records show gong farmers earned up to 3 times more than average laborers. The medieval career guidance counselor's advice was simple: hold your nose and think of the money. Most gong farmers worked at night to minimize the smell's impact on castle life and likely died young from disease exposure. Without them, though, castle life would have been even more unbearable than it already was for everyone else trapped within those stone walls. Life as a medieval jester wasn't all fun and games. Behind the jokes was a tough job that most people wouldn't want. They had to be smart, fast, and careful with every word. If you think they just made people laugh all day, you're in for a surprise. Kings and nobles didn't just hire anyone who could make silly noises. If that were true, most teenage boys in the kingdom would have been employed at court. They wanted someone clever who could read a room faster than a soldier could draw a sword. A bad joke at the wrong moment could turn a friendly feast into a fight between countries. The job interview for a court jester was nothing like today's applications. Singing was essential. Not just casual humming, but ballads and the ability to make up lyrics on the spot. Juggling was practically required. Storytelling abilities were tested thoroughly, as a jester might need to entertain guests for hours during long winter nights. Mimicry was perhaps the most dangerous yet valuable skill. Some jesters became so good at imitating noblemen that guards would sometimes mistake the actual nobles for jesters doing impressions. Not everyone chose to become a jester. Many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Historical records show that about 1 in 4 jesters began as peasants who caught a noble's eye. Others were captured during wars and gifted to courts, a human present wrapped in bells and colorful clothing. One dark aspect of jester history was the exploitation of people with physical differences or disabilities. Individuals with unusual features were sometimes forced into jester roles against their will. Courts across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East all have records of this cruel practice. The lucky ones were those who had actual training. These entertainers would travel from court to court with prepared routines. They were medieval comedians, except with higher stakes. Instead of being booed off stage, they risked being thrown in a dungeon if the king didn't laugh. Getting hired didn't guarantee a good life. You became the kingdom's walking entertainment system and verbal punching bag. Being woken at 3 in the morning because the king had a nightmare and needed cheering up was just part of the job. Jesters had to constantly understand the complex politics of court life. Records suggest the average jester lasted only about 4 years in service before being dismissed, running away, or meeting an unfortunate end. For those who did succeed, there were rewards beyond just staying alive. A clever joke at the right moment could earn you surprising benefits. After all, when you're the only one allowed to mock the king without losing your head, you better hope there's something worthwhile in your pay sack at the end of the week. So you've made it into the royal court as a jester. Congratulations! Your wardrobe now consists of mismatched clothes in bright colors, you wear a hat with bells, and your new boss can have you thrown into a dungeon on a whim. But at least you're getting paid, right? Some court jesters actually had it pretty good. They earned a regular wage, got food prepared by royal cooks, enjoyed a dry place to sleep, and received clothing, though usually clothing that looked like a rainbow exploded. The typical jester outfit wasn't exactly something you'd wear to impress a date, unless your date had a strong fondness for bells and pointed shoes. According to records from medieval European courts, a well-established jester could earn roughly the same as a mid-level craftsman. In England during the 1300s, royal account books show several jesters earning between 10 and 20 pounds per year, when a common laborer might earn only 2 pounds annually. The real money wasn't in the base salary. It was in the bonuses. A well-loved jester could get generous perks. One jester in England was rewarded with his own piece of land after making the king laugh during a political crisis. The land grant specified it was given for services of merriment and good counsel. Another court fool received an unusual but valuable form of payment: beer. Records from a German court show a jester received 1 gallon of beer per day every day for life. That's 365 gallons annually, enough to ensure his jokes got funnier as the evening wore on, at least in his own mind. Royal gifts sometimes included jewelry, gold coins, or even livestock, but these rewards only applied to jesters who worked for kings who actually liked them. If you messed up, your reward might be a night in the dungeon, or worse, a swift promotion to the executioner's guest list. Payment varied dramatically depending on the court. A jester in a wealthy kingdom might earn more than some minor nobles, while one in a smaller household might receive nothing more than food scraps and an itchy bed near the horses. Some jesters discovered that sleeping near horses meant they weren't the smelliest performer in the castle. Small comforts matter when you're at the bottom of the social ladder. Most jesters couldn't save enough to retire comfortably. They remained dependent on their royal patrons until they could no longer perform. They couldn't retire rich unless they were very smart about saving their money, very funny for a very long time, or very lucky. But for all their clever jokes and political savvy, jesters needed to do more than just make people laugh to earn their keep. Their job went far beyond simple comedy. What exactly did a medieval jester do all day? The answer: far more than just crack jokes. Court jesters were the Swiss Army knife of medieval entertainment. They needed multiple skills just to survive the week. First and foremost, jesters had to master several performing arts. They needed to sing ballads, play instruments ranging from simple drums to complex lutes, and dance elaborate routines that told stories or mocked current events. One English court record describes a jester who performed a dance so wild that he seemed possessed by 20 spirits, each more merry than the last. Tumbling and physical stunts were crowd favorites. Many jesters could perform backflips, handstands, and splits, abilities that became especially impressive after the 8th round of ale had been served at dinner. The more talented jesters developed signature moves that the court would request by name. Animal imitations ranked surprisingly high on the job requirements. Court records from France describe a jester who could mimic 14 different animals, from rooster calls to wolf howls. His bear impression was supposedly so convincing that hunting dogs would bark in alarm whenever he performed it. Puppetry and sound effects were also essential jester talents. Small puppet shows allowed them to tell stories that might be too politically dangerous to act out themselves. Some jesters became famous for their ability to mimic the sounds of battle, storms, or even the queen snoring. Though that last one could earn you a night in the dungeon if Her Majesty didn't find it amusing. But entertainment was only part of the job. Court jesters also served as message carriers between nobles, especially when those messages needed to be delivered with care. Bad news became slightly less bad when wrapped in a joke or a song. Medieval courts used jesters to announce tax increases, battle losses, or diplomatic insults because the messenger was less likely to be punished if everyone was laughing. The hardest part of the job might have been serving as the emotional outlet for the nobility. When kings or lords felt frustrated, bored, or angry, they often summoned their jesters to distract them. These situations were like defusing a bomb while juggling and singing. One wrong move, and things could explode. The role of scapegoat fell to jesters more often than they would have liked. If a nobleman spilled his drink, the jester might be blamed for distracting him. If a lady tripped, surely it was because the jester's performance made her dizzy. This blame game allowed nobles to save face by redirecting embarrassment. The best jesters turned this demanding job into a position of unusual influence. They became trusted companions who could speak truths others couldn't. They reminded kings of their humanity and helped diffuse tensions during heated moments. A jester who could make a furious king laugh during a tantrum might prevent decisions that would otherwise lead to bloodshed. This unusual combination of entertainer and trusted advisor created a strange kind of respect. While openly mocked for their appearance and behavior, skilled jesters were secretly valued for their wisdom and insight. And speaking of saying things others couldn't, the jester's ability to speak truth to power was perhaps their most dangerous yet valuable talent of all. Here's something that might surprise you about medieval courts. While most people would be executed for insulting the king, the court jester could openly mock him, and sometimes even get rewarded for it. This wasn't just an accident, it was actually part of the jester's job. Medieval kings weren't exactly known for taking criticism well, yet somehow the jester could point out the king's mistakes, make fun of his appearance, or question his decisions, as long as they did it in a way that made people laugh. This freedom of speech came with strict, unwritten rules. The jester had to be clever about delivery. Criticism hidden inside a funny story? Perfect. An insulting joke with a flattering twist at the end? Even better. A straight-up insult without any humor? That would get even a jester thrown in the dungeon. Or worse. Royal court records from across Europe contain fascinating examples of jesters who mastered this delicate art. In England, a jester gained fame for his annual performance that mocked the king's financial policies. Each year, on a specific holiday, he would perform an elaborate dance, recite a rhyme about taxes being too high, and end with a perfectly timed, well, let's call it a controlled release of gas. Yes, this jester literally earned land and gold by performing a dance that ended with a fancy fart aimed at royal tax policies. In the French court, historical accounts tell of a jester who once entered a royal meeting wearing a crown made of straw. When asked by the angry king what he was doing, the jester replied, "Practicing to be you, your majesty. You've been acting so foolish lately that soon we might need to trade hats." Instead of executing him, the king reportedly laughed and reconsidered his recent decisions. These weren't just amusing performances, they served a vital purpose in medieval governance. Kings were surrounded by people who constantly told them what they wanted to hear. In this environment, the jester became the only reliable source of honest feedback. Some rulers actively relied on their jesters for this reason. When you're the only one who can tell the king he looks ridiculous without being thrown in a river, you either learn timing or learn swimming. Several medieval memoirs written by royal advisors mention consulting with the court jester before bringing bad news to the king, hoping to learn the safest approach. But this unique freedom wasn't without risk. The protection wasn't perfect. Numerous accounts exist of jesters who went too far, read the room wrong, or simply caught the king on a bad day. Learning to tell jokes was the easy part of being a jester. Learning exactly when to stop was what kept you alive. Documents from various courts describe punishments ranging from beatings to imprisonment for jesters whose jokes crossed the line. Some disappeared from court records entirely after particularly bold performances, their fates unrecorded but easily guessed. The truly successful jesters developed an almost supernatural ability to sense moods and read subtle cues. This skill wasn't just about survival, it made them surprisingly influential. While court jesters with their unique position sometimes shaped kingdom decisions, those without royal protection faced a much harsher reality beyond the castle walls. Not every jester was lucky enough to score a job at the royal court. For every entertainer who wore fancy bells and ate food prepared by royal cooks, there were dozens who performed in village squares, dusty roads, and dirty taverns just to earn enough for their next meal. These wandering jesters lived a completely different life than their court counterparts. Court jesters worried about pleasing one boss, the king. Wandering jesters had to please everyone, everywhere, all the time, and medieval crowds weren't exactly known for their polite feedback. Traveling performers moved from town to town carrying everything they owned. Their stage was wherever people gathered, marketplaces, tavern yards, or village greens. They performed rain or shine, summer heat or winter freeze. Many wandering jesters died young from exposure to harsh weather or diseases caught while traveling. Unlike court jesters who received regular meals, wandering entertainers ate based on how well they performed that day. People threw coins if you were good, and rocks if you weren't. Nothing improves your juggling skills quite like knowing that failure means both hunger and a head injury. Records from medieval town councils show that wandering performers were rarely welcomed by local authorities. Many towns had laws forbidding masterless men from staying more than 1 or 2 nights. This meant constant travel, sleeping in barns, under wagons, or in ditches by the roadside. Some jesters joined traveling groups of entertainers that performed at seasonal festivals, markets, and occasionally at minor noble houses. Traveling in numbers provided some safety, but also meant splitting the already meager earnings. Performing for commoners rather than nobles brought its own challenges. Crowds were often drunk, rowdy, and quick to turn violent if not entertained. A court jester might fear the dungeon for a bad joke, but a street performer feared the immediate fist of a disappointed farmer with arms the size of tree trunks. To survive, wandering jesters needed an incredible memory. They had to learn hundreds of jokes, songs, and stories suitable for different regions. What got laughs in one village could start a fight in the next due to local rivalries or different dialects. Health problems were perhaps the biggest challenge. If you were sick or injured, no one cared. There was no sick leave, no disability payments. You either performed or went hungry. Many jesters developed chronic ailments from years of physical stunts, exposure to the elements, and inadequate nutrition. Competition was fierce and sometimes deadly. Prime performing spots in busy markets or during festivals were fought over, sometimes literally. When your entire livelihood depends on standing in exactly the right spot at the right time, you defend that spot fiercely. Despite these hardships, some wandering jesters achieved remarkable success. A few became famous enough that towns would actually pay them to visit. Others developed such unique skills that wealthy merchants would hire them for private events. For most, however, life as a wandering jester meant existing one joke away from disaster, with no safety net if the punchline fell flat. While court jesters worried about keeping their heads, traveling performers worried about keeping their teeth, both from angry audiences and from the simple lack of food. Jesters had no special immunity to disease. Despite their colorful clothes and quick wit, they caught lice, fleas, fevers, and worse, just like everyone else in medieval times. In fact, their lifestyle often puts them at even greater risk than the average person. Court jesters lived in castles, which might sound great until you learn what medieval castles were actually like. Real medieval castles were cold, damp, and crawling with vermin. Rats scurried through the halls, bringing fleas and disease. Drafty windows let in rain and snow. Smoke from fireplaces filled the rooms because chimneys were poorly designed. Medical records from royal households reveal that respiratory illnesses were extremely common among court staff, including jesters. One medieval doctor wrote that he could identify castle servants by their cough alone, noting that jesters had the most distinctive hack because they needed to clear their throats before performances. Some jesters were even forced to entertain plague victims to lift spirits during outbreaks. Court records from the 1400s mention jesters being sent to perform in quarantine areas, a job assignment that basically amounted to a death sentence. Few returned from these grim performances. Food safety didn't exist as a concept in medieval times. Jesters ate what everyone else ate: partially spoiled meat, vegetables grown in human waste, and bread that often contained fillers to make flour go further. Water was usually unsafe to drink, which is why even breakfast often included beer or wine instead. It's hard to be funny first thing in the morning, but it's even harder when you're slightly drunk because your morning cup of water would have given you deadly diarrhea. Dental problems were particularly hard on jesters. How do you make people laugh when you're dealing with an abscessed tooth? There were no dentists, just barbers who would pull rotting teeth without painkillers. Court records mention payments to barbers for treating jesters' dental problems, suggesting this was a common issue. For traveling jesters, health risks multiplied. Sleeping outdoors or in crowded, filthy inns exposed them to even more diseases. They walked miles between towns, developing blisters that could become infected. Winter travel meant frostbite. Summer meant heat stroke. Despite these health challenges, or perhaps because of them, jokes about illness, death, and bodily functions were actually popular in medieval times. People used dark humor to cope with the constant presence of disease and death. Poop jokes weren't just for children. They were high comedy when everyone regularly witnessed the horror of dysentery. Jesters who could find humor in these grim realities became especially valued. One thing people always remembered was who made them laugh when everything else was falling apart. Records show that during the worst plague outbreaks, rulers would keep their jesters close, not just for entertainment, but for emotional support. A jester who could make jokes while the world seemed to be ending earned a special kind of respect. In a world filled with disease, a jester's job was to make light of misery, even when that misery was knocking on their own door. All performances eventually end. For medieval jesters, growing old meant facing a harsh truth. No retirement homes existed for court fools. Once knees became too stiff for cartwheels or voices too scratchy for singing, professional foolery days were numbered. Documents from the 1400s reveal that over 2/3 of court jesters simply vanished from castle payment records after reaching their 40s, considered elderly in medieval times. Unlike craftspeople who could teach apprentices or farmers who could switch to easier tasks, aging jesters had few choices. Their entire value depended on quick thinking and physical ability, qualities that faded with time. A fortunate minority managed to stay in castles with less demanding roles. Court records mention former jesters becoming storytellers for noble children once tumbling became impossible. Others became keepers of entertainment traditions, teaching younger performers the jokes and songs that had pleased previous rulers. Some court fools saved enough coins to open taverns where customers had to pay for drinks, whether they laughed at the jokes or not. Finally, a captive audience. Religious houses occasionally accepted former entertainers, especially those who had performed in church plays or could read and write. The switch from making bawdy jokes to copying religious texts represented quite the career change. One monastery document mentions a former jester who couldn't stop drawing funny faces in the margins of sacred books. For those without savings or royal favor, choices were bleak. Some joined traveling performers as costume makers. Others became beggars using their skills to attract pity coins. A number ended up as village wise fools, strange characters who survived on community kindness while offering occasional entertainment and odd wisdom. Castle account books rarely mention payments to retired jesters. King Henry of England provided yearly money to an elderly court fool. £6 annually, enough for basic food and shelter, but little else. Such generosity was extremely uncommon. Most rulers simply replaced aging entertainers with younger, livelier performers. When you spent decades making nobles laugh about getting old and feeble, the joke eventually became your life story. Perhaps the saddest part was how quickly even famous jesters were forgotten. Their purpose was creating memorable moments, yet history kept few of their achievements. We know more about ordinary servants than the people who kept powerful rulers entertained during wars and disasters. The end for most jesters wasn't recorded with importance. No special graves were built, no songs remembered them. The court simply continued with someone new. The fresh ruler wanted a different fool with original jokes. and yesterday's star performer might be found begging at the castle gate, a sudden fall for someone who once commanded attention in royal halls. While the jester's career began with laughter, it often finished in silence, showing that medieval entertainment truly ranked among history's most difficult and thankless professions.